Hannibal battles his way across the frozen Alps, bloodies the ground with tens of thousands of Rome's fiercest warriors, and makes military history on a battlefield where he slaughters 70,000 men in one day. Hannibal is a killer. Hannibal is a conqueror. Hannibal is the Annihilator. The year 219 BC, the man, Hannibal Barca of Carthage, one of history's greatest and deadliest generals. Hannibal burns the Roman town of Saguntum to the ground. These smoldering flames are just the initial sparks of the raging inferno that will soon engulf Europe as Hannibal the Annihilator launches a bloody reign of vengeance aimed to crush mighty Rome. Hannibal's home of Carthage is a commercial beacon on the northern coast of Africa. Their trade and military influence reverberates throughout the Mediterranean.
They traded far and wide, as far off to the eastern Mediterranean. There's even some evidence that they traded as far west through the Straits of Gibraltar to England.
400 short miles from Carthage is Rome. Though not yet the colossal empire they will become, their military might threatens Carthaginian commercial dominance in the region.
The Romans are very much a warlike imperial people. They're not an empire yet, but you could definitely see this republic starting to expand its borders. It was only a matter of time before Rome and Carthage bumped into one another.
Hannibal's personal and brutal destruction of Saguntum is a bloody invitation, hand-delivered to Rome, inviting them to join his deadly game of butchery and annihilation.
The siege of Saguntum lasted 8 months, as far as we know. We're pretty much lacking in detail from a historical perspective. What we do know, however, is that once the walls were breached and Carthaginian troops went in, they went house to house and hunted down almost all of the Roman families, killed the Roman males, and sold the women and children into slavery.
Through the smoke and stench of scorched earth and torched Roman corpses comes Rome's response: capture Hannibal and crucify him.
It's a very famous scene by the Greek historian Polybius, where the Roman ambassador grabs his toga, a fold in each hand, and says, "Rome offers you peace or war. Choose, it matters not to Rome."
Hannibal and the Carthaginians gladly choose to fight. It is war, the seeds of which were planted nearly half a century earlier. Then, Carthage and Rome bloodied the Mediterranean Sea in what is called the First Punic War, named for the Latin term for Carthage, Punica.
400,000 casualties, almost 15% of the military manpower of the entire country of Italy was lost in that war. It was a terribly bloody war.
The war eventually ends in a military draw, but for Carthage, the peace treaty is especially costly.
Part of the deal they make with Rome is that Carthage will limit their navy to 100 ships. This is pretty crippling to an empire that was a naval and commercial trading power.
With most of their commercial fleet gone and their pockets empty, Carthage uses its military power to exploit the riches of Spain.
Turns out that Spain's got vast silver mines, and the Carthaginians quickly gain a hold on them and amass a fortune. They decide to build up their land defenses instead of their navy, which had been pretty much depleted in the First Punic War.
Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Barca, one of Carthage's most accomplished and battle-hardened men, leads the army into Spain.
Now, Hamilcar Barca is the founder of a great military dynasty in Carthage called the Barcids, after the name Barca, and he really hated the Romans.
Young Hannibal is immersed in a violent and bloody world as he watches his father, teacher, and role model engage in fiercely brutal combat.
Hannibal is only 9 when Hamilcar takes over Spain, so he essentially grows up on the battlefield.
Hamilcar provides young Hannibal with a hands-on education in brutality and warfare.
So by the time he's 19, his whole life has been in a military camp. And here he watches his father and other general officers and learns how to command men.
Hannibal learns that to build an army of loyal fighters willing to march by his side into the horrors of war, he must sometimes punish his own. If a Carthaginian officer fails in battle, he is crucified in the public square.
Carthaginian rule in Spain is downright cruel. It's based on fire, sword, and crucifixion.
But Hannibal also motivates his men by sleeping where they sleep, eating what they eat, and fighting where they fight. They obediently follow his words, his sword, and his deep-seated desire for revenge against Rome, which he inherits from his father. But Hamilcar will never taste revenge. In 228 BC, he dies suddenly, some say assassinated.
His place is taken by his son-in-law, called Hasdrubal the Splendid, who continues on again for about another 6 years, building Carthaginian power, increasing its scope, and then finally he's assassinated too. And there's some question historically of whether or not Hannibal had a hand in this.
It is finally Hannibal's hour. He is only 26 years old, but commands the entire Carthaginian army. But he is fierce, battle-tested, and driven.
Legend has it that Hamilcar made the young Hannibal swear an oath on the altar of Baal that he would spend his life in opposing and then ultimately destroying Rome.
In 219 BC, with his father's hunger for revenge burning inside him, and with Saguntum aflame, Hannibal launches his attack against Rome. The Second Punic War is on.
Hannibal amasses a strike force of about 50,000 soldiers. But because he has no navy, he's got to invade Italy by land.
Hannibal's on the move. From Spain, he leads his fighting force of about 50,000 north along the Mediterranean coast toward Rome. A grueling 2.5 months later, an exhausted but battle-ready Hannibal reaches the Rhone River. But Hannibal is shocked to discover the Romans had caught wind of the advance and launched a strike force to intercept.
The Romans had caught wind of Hannibal's movements in Spain, but instead of heading directly to Spain, they were smart. They looked at a map, figured out where Hannibal was going to march, and tried to block the land route to the Italian peninsula on the coast of the Mediterranean.
It is the great military Roman general Publius Cornelius Scipio who leads the attack against Hannibal. Scipio's force, 10,000 men strong, is in Massilia, a Roman ally on the Mediterranean coast. Hannibal's force, 5 times as large, has crossed the Rhone River. Scipio sends 300 of his cavalry up the Rhone to find Hannibal. Hannibal orders 500 cavalry to scout the Roman advance. The two reconnaissance units collide. War between Rome and Carthage rages once again.
This is a small skirmish between scouting parties. In this particular skirmish, Hannibal's forces take the brunt of the attack and then retreat. Scipio orders his entire force to follow.
Hannibal knows Scipio is only a few days' march away, and Scipio is a talented commander. He should be able to give Hannibal a run for his money.
But when Scipio arrives at the location where Hannibal's army should be, they're gone. It's as if Hannibal's whole army has vanished into thin air.
Scipio forced Hannibal to change his plan. Now, instead of marching along the Mediterranean coast to Rome, Hannibal's attack will come from the north, through the Alps.
The reason why Hannibal came by land through Spain and over the Alps was not because it was a great strategic choice. It was, in fact, the route that was forced upon him by, essentially, Roman events, by the situation he confronted at the time.
Hannibal reaches the Alps in autumn of 218 BC. At this altitude, he and his 50,000 soldiers face freezing temperatures and treacherous ice on a narrow rocky terrain. The men are hungry, their supplies are limited, and he's leading more than just infantry. He's also leading 9,000 cavalry and 37 elephants.
All the major armies had a few elephants in them. When the Greeks fought Carthage in one of their little skirmishes, the Carthaginians used to have chariots, and they were driven from the battlefield by the elephants, at which point they said, let's get rid of the chariots and replace them with elephants. And so as a consequence, by the time of the Punic War, Carthage has, in her home, just in her home base, she has 300 trained elephants living in the walls of the city of Carthage. So that's how you get the elephant introduced in warfare.
The crossing of the Alps with such a large force is a difficult military feat. For Hannibal and his army, it has horrific consequences.
Men freeze, men starve. At one point, a landslide completely blocks their way. It's absolutely hellish. Supplies are even running low, and they're not even to the most difficult part of the crossing yet.
Well, they happen upon this Gallic village where the Gauls offer provisions and supplies. Hannibal accepts the help, but he definitely is suspicious of their motives because he knows that sometimes the Gauls are friendly and sometimes they are not.
Hannibal doesn't fully trust the Gauls, but eventually accepts their help. The Gauls direct Hannibal to a narrow pass which leads to a gorge.
Hannibal's original suspicions were right on. The guides suddenly bolt.
It's a trap. (218 BC), Hannibal leads his Carthaginian army over the treacherous Alps to invade Rome. Along the way, marauding Gauls ambush Hannibal with a barrage of boulders and arrow fire.
Hannibal encounters different tribes throughout his campaign. They were mainly Gauls. This is a tribal people who lived in what's now modern-day France. They're not a unified people and usually don't ally themselves against a common enemy. So sometimes they'll join his war on Rome, and other times they'll attack him.
In this case, the Gauls are out for blood. The gorge turns into a gauntlet of death.
Gauls block both ends of the gorge, but Hannibal's troops fight their way out, leaving the butchered enemy in their wake. After some 30 grueling days, Hannibal and his men emerge from the Alps. When they finally arrive on the northern plains of Italy, nearly a third of Hannibal's army has perished.
They lose about 18,000 infantry, about a third of the cavalry, which would be maybe 4,000 horse, you know, we arrive with, say, 27 elephants, you lose a third of the elephants.
But Hannibal has always known the crossing would be costly. From the very beginning of the war, he's had a plan to replenish his forces, a plan that relied on his elephants.
Part of Hannibal's strategy in crossing the Alps was that he understood that he didn't have enough manpower to fight the Romans. Therefore, he would have to acquire it once he got into Italy. How was he going to do that? He was going to do that by attracting to his standard the Gauls, the Celts and Gauls, who hated the Romans because they've been fighting one another for 500 years, and hopefully as well get some Roman allied states to defect. So the reason for bringing the 37 elephants over the Alps was really to impress, in a political sense, both the Gauls and the allied states that this was a serious army.
Hannibal's elephants thunder into northern Italy. They successfully lure Gallic tribes to the Carthaginian side. By November 218 BC, Hannibal's numbers swell to nearly 40,000. Rome answers with 40,000 of its own soldiers to face Hannibal's threat. Both armies are now on a collision course that will rock the ancient world and rewrite military history.
The armies of Carthage and Rome couldn't be more different. Hannibal's men are mercenary soldiers from all over the map.
Hannibal's army is from different parts of the region, many of them mercenaries, drawn to his legendary leadership in battle. The light infantry are from Libya. These men carry a small round shield and fight with a small sword or javelin. Heavy infantry are warriors from Gaul, men who run into battle naked, intimidating their enemies with their deadly two-handed broadswords. Heavy cavalry is from Spain and Northern Europe. Their weapon of choice is either a bowed sword called a falcata or a deadly longsword.
Hannibal's ability to orchestrate these different types of forces in a coordinated attack is what makes him truly a remarkable general. The Roman army is much different than Hannibal's forces. Where the Carthaginians are very diverse, the Romans are quite uniform.
Roman soldiers are ablaze in armor. Bronze helmets protect their heads. Chainmail or brass breastplates defend their bodies. Each soldier carries one of history's deadliest throwing spears, the pilum.
That long metal rod was made of soft metal with a hook. When it went through the shield, the weight of the wooden body would bend it. You couldn't take the pilum out of the shield. Now the enemy had a choice of fighting with a shield with a spear stuck into it, or what they foolishly did very often is simply throw the shield away. Not a good move against Roman infantry.
Slaughter also comes in the form of a straight sword, forged of iron, ideal for up-close and personal combat. Their scutum shield provides almost complete protection from missile attacks. While Hannibal's army is cobbled together, his opponent is a much more cohesive fighting force.
The Roman army was a true national army. They all spoke the same language, they all had the same equipment, and they were all trained to the same tactics.
But the most significant difference is their style of battle.
So you have this Roman force of highly disciplined citizen soldiers equipped and trained to go straight at the enemy against a group of professionals that can hit you in any number of ways.
At the Ticinus River, these radically different fighting styles clash in a hurricane of violence.
Hannibal's light cavalry surround the Romans, slash at the Roman cavalry, then back off, then re-attack. It's chaos and confusion, not what the Romans are used to.
The blood of 2,000 slain Roman soldiers drenches the ground. It is a shocking defeat.
The key point about the little skirmish at the Ticinus River was that Publius Scipio was wounded.
The Romans replaced Scipio with General Sempronius Longus, a strong leader with an even stronger temper.
Sempronius is a hothead. He's desperate for glory, and his one-year term as army commander is almost up. He's champing at the bit to fight, and Hannibal knows it.
Some evidence of Hannibal's brilliance as a military commander was the fact that he studied his adversaries closely. Now, where he got this information isn't clear. Surely the number of Roman commanders was relatively small, and so they would have been well known. But also my guess is that the truly excellent Carthaginian intelligence may have been at work here, so that whenever he was prepared for a battle, he knew who was in command on the other side, and he studied him closely, knew for his strengths and weaknesses. And in the case of Sempronius, he knew Sempronius well. He knew he was a hothead, and he played him like a fiddle.
The two enemy armies camp on opposite sides of the Trebia River, about 70 short yards apart.
It's not much of an obstacle in a physical sense, but it can become an obstacle when you realize that if you have to cross it, it's November, it's gray, and it's snowing. And so that's going to be, any army that tries to cross that river under those conditions is going to suffer somewhat.
Hannibal's strategy? Take advantage of the frigid temperatures, the Roman commander's fiery temper, and use the element of surprise.
He sends 2,000 or 3,000 cavalry in the early morning dawn across the river to attack the Roman camp.
The Romans are shocked awake. They stumble around the cold with no food. The Roman general Sempronius is furious. He orders the men to cross the river and attack, so they plunge into the icy water to chase Hannibal's men. Not the best way to start your day.
40,000 Roman infantry and 4,000 cavalry cross the river. They line up for battle in a formation called a legio, made up of several maniples.
Maniple literally means a handful of men. Each maniple consists of about 120 soldiers.
The Romans arrange themselves in a checkerboard configuration. This is a force specifically designed to move forward and crush its enemy. But Hannibal has his own crushing machines, pachyderms, the heavy tanks of the Carthaginian army. They charge at the flanks of the Roman cavalry.
Nearly impervious to spears, the elephant's earth-shaking assault scatters the Allied horsemen in sheer terror.
Hannibal's cavalry, 10,000 strong, far outnumbers the Romans.
His Numidian cavalry is so fast and agile that they appear to be everywhere at once.
Hannibal's heavy Spanish and Celtic cavalry slam with such force, they demolish what's left of the Roman cavalry.
Hannibal's Carthaginian cavalry turns inward and smashes the Roman flanks. Hannibal surrounds the Romans on 3 sides, but he is not done yet. Hannibal has just crossed the Trebia River and has a bloody surprise for the Roman army. Using specially trained horses, Hannibal has successfully hidden cavalry in the tall grass.
Trumpet blasts and an elite Carthaginian cavalry force charges from the swamp. The Romans turn around to see 2,000 horses storm up from behind. It must have been absolutely terrifying.
The Carthaginian cavalry blindsides the Romans, who are then pushed back toward the river and cut down mercilessly.
Of the 40,000 men, Roman and Allies, that took the field that day, 30,000 died. 30,000 met their deaths on the bank of the Trebia River. It was the worst defeat that the Romans had suffered since the defeat against the Gauls 125 years earlier.
The Battle of the Trebia is an absolutely classic example of how to use tactical surprise at a key moment in the battle. The result was complete slaughter.
Hannibal does suffer losses at Trebia. All but one of his elephants die of starvation or exhaustion. He rides the lone survivor named Sirius. The horror of Trebia spurs the Roman Senate to raise 4 new legions, 20,000 men. Rome also appoints 2 new consuls to lead the men into battle, Gnaeus Servilius Geminus and Gaius Flaminius. Their target, Hannibal. Their mission, seek and destroy. In the spring of 217 BC, the Romans decide that the best way to block Hannibal's advance southward is to divide their forces. Geminus travels northeast to coastal Ariminus. Flaminius heads northwest to Arretium, but they leave a southern route open through the marshes of the lower Arno River Valley.
Now, the Arno marshes were an enormously large, swampy area created by the Arno River. I mean, it's full of muck, insects, snakes. It is a terrible natural barrier, so much so that neither of the Roman commanders blocking the roads on either side thought anyone would be crazy enough to try to march through these marshes. Well, Hannibal is known for doing the unexpected, and don't you know, he tries to penetrate these marshes.
The surprise maneuver does prove costly for Hannibal.
While riding atop Sirius, his last remaining elephant, Hannibal is supposedly stung in the eye by an insect. He gets infected, and he becomes blind in that eye.
But Hannibal remains unstoppable. He slips through the 2 Roman forces and arrives at Tuscany, a Roman ally, and torches the landscape.
Hannibal starts burning the Tuscan plain. Houses, towns, slaughtering animals, chopping down trees.
Hannibal's plan, destroy the area and infuriate the Roman general Flaminius, who watches the devastation from the city walls of Arretium.
And Flaminius is just horrified by it. He's horrified not only so much that this area is being destroyed, but he knows what Hannibal is doing.
Instead of attacking Flaminius inside the city walls, Hannibal is sending a message to other Roman allies.
And what Hannibal is saying to that ally is, if you stay with Rome, this is what you can expect. He's trying to woo that ally away. And Flaminius also knows that it's a sign of Roman weakness that you cannot stop this.
Hannibal knows his enemy well and wants to lure Flaminius onto the battlefield.
Why? That's his plan. Destroy as many Roman armies, kill as many Romans as you can until the Roman Senate tires of war and sues for peace. You can't do that with siege warfare. You've got to draw the enemy out into battle.
Hannibal continues to taunt Flaminius by marching his army right past the walls of Arretium, flaunting his courage and power.
Hannibal is just far enough away to tease Flaminius. He's really saying, come on, if you've got any courage, you'll leave your little protective fort and come and fight like a man.
Finally, Flaminius takes the bait.
Hannibal leads Flaminius on a wild chase across Tuscany. He stays a day or two ahead, which allows him to survey the terrain and pick the most advantageous place to fight.
Moving quickly, Hannibal and his 30,000 men race past the small village of Pasignano into a hilly forest along Lake Trasimene. Flaminius is in hot pursuit. The road leads Hannibal, now on horseback, through what's known as a defile, a narrow passage between the mountains and the lake's shoreline.
By now, all of Hannibal's elephants are dead. And as he marches into this defile, this narrow passage between the cliffs and the lake, he becomes immediately aware of the landscape's tactical advantages.
Hannibal has discovered the perfect location for his next battle. It comes with its own natural advantage.
In the morning, a thick fog comes off the lake and obscures the entire valley. It's made-to-order camouflage.
Hannibal orders some of his men to camp at the far end of the valley, in plain view of all who pass through the defile.
We're told that Hannibal sends scouts far ahead into the hills to light campfires. He wants to convince the Romans that he's farther away than he actually is.
Still chasing Hannibal, Flaminius reaches Pasignano and sends a reconnaissance team into the defile.
They come back and it's too narrow. There can't be any possibility of ambush. The next day, around dawn, the Roman army begins to move through the defile.
As Flaminius reaches the valley, the eerie lake fog rolls in once again. In the distance, Flaminius can see the fires of Hannibal's camp on the hill.
Flaminius thinks, I finally got him. I've got Hannibal trapped and it's time to tear him apart.
Flaminius orders 6,000 Roman soldiers to rush up the hill and attack Hannibal.
The legion double times, gets out there, climbs the hill, and smashes into Hannibal's camp.
The Romans hack at Hannibal's rearguard infantry in wild combat. Suddenly, Hannibal's men turn and run, enticing the Roman soldiers to pursue. Hannibal then springs one of the deadliest traps in military history. Hannibal Barca of Carthage is about to spring one of military history's greatest traps. 30,000 Carthaginian infantry and cavalry rise out of the morning fog and smash into the stunned Roman force. The bloodbath begins. The battle rages along the shores of Lake Trasimene in northwest Italy. Hannibal's Spanish and African heavy infantry hit the Roman front. Wild Celtic tribesmen strike the center. Numidian light cavalry crush the Romans from the rear.
Romans are trapped, and it is terrible. They're in line of march. They're not even set for combat formation. Their weapons on out, and they're taken right in the flank by this large army, and it just slaughters them. It slaughters them.
Hannibal makes two big gambles at Trasimene. First is that the fog will return to hide his 30,000 men in the hills. Second, that Flaminius will jump at his decoy camp. And he wins both bets.
Out of 20,000 men, 15,000 die in about 3 hours, including Flaminius himself. Hannibal's losses, 1,500. That's a kill ratio of 10 to 1.
In one of the most successful ambushes in history, another Roman army has been wiped out. At age 27, Hannibal is already a legendary military tactician.
In less than 2 years, Hannibal has handed Rome 3 catastrophic defeats. 2,000 men at Ticinus, 30,000 at Trebia, and now 15,000 more at Trasimene. Rome had never seen such a series of defeats in its history.
In the face of this defeat, the Roman Senate makes a bold, perhaps desperate decision. They vote to appoint a temporary dictator over the military to put an end to Hannibal's reign of terror. He is Quintus Fabius Maximus.
Selecting a dictator is extremely rare in Roman history. They highly value their republic, and so the idea of handing absolute power to one man isn't taken lightly. In fact, the position came with an automatic time limit of 6 months.
Fabius raises an army of 90,000 men, the largest yet in Roman history. But he isn't going to use them in direct combat against Hannibal.
Fabius is an excellent strategic thinker. He takes one look around, looks at the Roman manpower, naval resources, food resources, the geography, and then compares them with Hannibal's small army, away from home, can't resupply, no navy. He concludes quite correctly that Hannibal can't win, that essentially there's no point to continue to try to defeat Hannibal in the field.
And this becomes the famous Fabian strategy. Do not engage the enemy in head-to-head battle. Harass him. When he sends foraging teams to look for food, kill them. If anybody provides sanctuary in a small town, burn the place down.
Fabius's strategy leaves Hannibal and his men hungry and tired. They are constantly hunted and harassed and never able to resupply.
Fabius' strategies were not only good, they were exactly the strategy that Rome needed to stop a man like Hannibal, whose whole tactical and strategic vision was based on fighting battles. To have a strategy that's battle-centric, you have to have an enemy who obliges. By refusing to give battle, Fabius denied Hannibal to fight the war that he wanted to fight.
This is a strategy that would work, but the problem is, like all strategy, it depends on political will. It depends on the political will of the Senate to essentially continue the Fabian strategy, perhaps for 3, 4, 5 years. Well, what happens is, this is not the Roman way.
Despite the strategy's success so far, the impatient Roman Senate forces Fabius to resign after 6 months. They return to their more typical mode of government with the election of 2 civilian co-consuls. Paulus and Varro are chosen and directed to defeat Hannibal as quickly as possible. Varro wants to fight Hannibal in an all-out war. Paulus, however, does not want to be lured into battle.
This is problematic because there's a combination of 2 Roman armies. The 2 co-consuls, Paulus and Varro, trade off command every other day. It may sound insane, but one day Paulus was the supreme commander, the next day Varro. Hannibal is well aware of this and knows who he'd rather fight.
Hannibal's strength is in face-to-face combat, and he wants to fight Varro's war. Hannibal gathers his intelligence, lies in wait, then sends in a strike team just as Varro takes command. On cue, Varro roars into action and sends a fighting force to meet Hannibal near Cannae, Italy. Varro's colossal army is made up of more than 80,000 Roman and Allied foot soldiers and 6,000 cavalry. It is the most massive Roman fighting force ever to take the field at one time. Varro arranges his soldiers in a typical Roman maniple formation, but adds a new twist to the old formula.
What they do is they pack themselves a little tighter than before so that the front is shorter, but the depth is thicker.
Only 300 feet away, Hannibal deploys his own infantry force of 35,000, but in a unique configuration, never before used on any Western battlefield.
Normally, an infantry line would be deployed straight. He deploys it in a concave bow, with the belly of the bow facing closest to the Roman lines in a kind of semicircle.
Hannibal himself leads the infantry force from the middle of the line. The Battle of Annihilation begins. The infantry battle is fierce. But it's the Carthaginian cavalry that scores the first punishing blow.
heavy cavalry smashes into the Roman cavalry with such incredible force that it shatters it. I mean, between the dead and the wounded and the dead horses, the rest just take flight.
Trying to outrun this tidal wave of death, the Romans are chopped down in full stride. It is the beginning of one of the greatest battles of all time. It's the Second Punic War between Carthage and Rome. Two great armies slaughter each other on the plains of Cannae, battling over who will control the entire Mediterranean region. Hannibal has configured his army in a unique semicircle. On the flanks, the Carthaginian cavalry commander detaches part of his force to help the Numidian light cavalry on the opposite side of the battlefield.
With a nearly 4-to-1 advantage, the Carthaginian cavalry makes short work of the Roman cavalry on the flanks.
In the center, the Roman infantry drives Hannibal back. But it's a ruse. Hannibal is giving ground on purpose.
And this is why Hannibal originally assembled his men in a semicircle. He knew that the center would give ground, and he knew his flanks would hold. Slowly the center collapses, and the Romans would think they're winning and commit more troops in the center.
The original bow shape of the Carthaginian line now resembles a V.
As Hannibal's infantry flexes inward, the Roman units are drawn deeper and deeper into a V-shaped line. And as they go further, they get completely packed together.
Pressed into this V, the Roman infantry can only move in one direction, straight ahead.
Livy, one of the Roman historians, tells us the pressure was so great that Roman soldiers' arms were forced against their bodies. They could not lift their swords.
On Hannibal's signal, the African phalanxes turn in toward the middle and crush the Romans from the sides. Hannibal blocks in front. The African infantry squeezes the side. Hannibal's older brother, Hasdrubal, uses cavalry to slash from behind. The Romans are jammed into a kill box.
Hasdrubal the Brilliant now rides around in back of the Romans, hits them in the rear. This is a famous double envelopment. It had never been done in the history of warfare before. Never. And it's a brilliant maneuver.
What Hannibal realized is that while the Roman army is nearly unstoppable as it attacks straight ahead, its mandibles can only move forward and back. They cannot turn and they cannot envelop. And if you know exactly how your enemy is going to fight, it's not that hard to figure out how to defeat it.
By the time the sun sets, Hannibal has slaughtered an unbelievable number of Romans.
The Battle of Cannae was so full of death that it gave rise to a new term in military terminology. It's called the Battle of Annihilation. The Battle of Annihilation. The enemy wasn't defeated, it was annihilated.
Cannae ranks as one of the deadliest and most brutal battles in history. More than 70,000 Romans are butchered in a single day.
70,000 dead, killed in an area only twice the size of Central Park. Ask yourself, this is an age before mechanical weapons. How long does it take to kill 70,000 human beings with swords and spears, one at a time? The answer seems to be about 6 hours.
Hannibal is on the verge of realizing his dream of Rome's destruction. But the victory at Cannae will actually mark the end of Hannibal's military success on the Italian peninsula.
After the battle, the commander of the Numidian cavalry, Hannibal, urges Hannibal to march immediately on Rome. But Hannibal refuses. This leads Hannibal to exclaim, "Hannibal, you know how to conquer, but you do not know how to use your victories."
Hannibal might believe that Rome will finally bow before him and surrender after their devastating defeat.
Or maybe he realizes a siege of Rome will be impossible to maintain without reinforcements and supplies. Cannae is about 260 miles away from Rome, so he gets close, but not close enough.
Whatever the reason, the destruction at Cannae is the closest Hannibal ever gets to fulfilling the blood oath of revenge he made to his father.
Hannibal does try to negotiate a peace deal with the Romans after Cannae, but the Romans refuse. In fact, the Romans actually outlaw the word peace. No citizen could ever consider it out loud.
Ultimately, the Romans decide to return to the Fabian strategy of containment. Instead of trying to beat Hannibal on the battlefield, they will try to outlast him.
Think about this for a minute. Rome, with all their imperial destructive ways, says, you know what? We can't beat this guy. We can only harass him. We can only contain him.
Hannibal was able to get many of the southern Italian towns to defect to him, so he was able to live off the land. But try as he might, he can never fulfill his oath to his father. He never burns Rome to the ground.
For all his triumphs on the battlefield, Hannibal's campaign must be seen as a failure. He eventually abandons his quest to destroy Rome and sails back to Carthage.
If you want to think about a more modern example, you could look at Robert E. Lee. During the American Civil War, Lee won nearly every one of his battles, but ultimately lost the war.
No matter how many battles you win, the ultimate goal of a battle is a means to an end, to win the war strategically. From that perspective, Hannibal's campaigns were a failure. The individual battles were victorious, but the strategy of bringing Rome to heel and making it sign a peace treaty failed. You don't get any points in warfare for trying.
The greatest irony of Hannibal's invasion is that it sets in motion the events that will turn the Republic of Rome into an empire that will conquer the ancient world.
Had there been no Hannibal, had there been no Second Punic War, there's no reason to suspect that Rome would ever have expanded to the degree that it did.
Hannibal's tactics and stealth, his bloodlust and determination, his savagery and genius are all taught to modern military commanders throughout the world. But the greatest lesson might be that while Hannibal could annihilate the armies of Rome, he could not ultimately destroy Rome. These are the ancient Israelites. Relentless warriors described in the Bible as soldiers of God. They are fierce, unwavering, and ruthless. Their leader is Joshua, a brilliant military strategist poised to bring the Israelites into the promised land, the land of Canaan. To fulfill this mission, Joshua and his army fight some of the most brutal battles described in the Bible. Perhaps none is more well known than the Battle of Jericho. An intricate tale of espionage, psychological warfare, and the extermination of an entire population. But Jericho is only the first in a long military campaign designed to conquer the land of Canaan. A campaign filled with blood and slaughter. Joshua's military might is first described in the Bible during the Great Exodus campaign out of Egypt in the 14th century BC. Soon after the Israelites cross the Sea of Reeds, they are ambushed by a Canaanite group called the Amalekites. The Israelite leader at the time is Moses. He handpicks his fiercest warrior, the young Joshua, to be his field commander. Joshua fights brilliantly and leads the Israelites to victory. But both he and Moses realize the Israelites need to be a more effective fighting force if they are going to invade and conquer Canaan and its dozens of fortified city-states.
The Israelites are light infantry guerrillas. They can't engage the enemy on the open plains. The Canaanites have chariots, and they could easily cut them down. So they stay in the desert for 40 years, creating a strong and more powerful army.
Joshua is impatient to invade Canaan, but accepts the wisdom of Moses, who believes the Israelites should stay in the desert longer and train a new and larger fighting force. After 40 years, the army's number swells to around 8,000. A force whose time has finally come. The first step is to leave their camp at Kadesh Barnea. But walled Canaanite cities block the route north. So Moses and Joshua lead some 35,000 men, women, and children south, then east into the Jordan Valley. The Israelites pass peacefully through the land of the Edomites and the Moabites. But soon they encounter an unfriendly tribe who refuse to let them pass, the Ammonites. In this first test of the newly trained Israelite army, Joshua shows he hasn't lost his military prowess and leads his army to victory. The Bible says Moses, Joshua, and the Israelites then attack several other tribes in the Jordan Valley on their way to Canaan. They marched on and went up the road to Bashan, and King Og of Bashan, with all his people, came out to engage them in battle. They defeated him and his sons and all his people until no remnant was left.
Why the need for this kind of brutality? And the answer from a military perspective is quite simply. The Israelites have no intention of living in the Jordan Valley. Their intention is to move their army to the border of Canaan, so that the area along the Jordan River becomes a strategic launching point for the future attack on Canaan. One cannot leave significant hostile forces in one's rear.
The Bible tells us that Moses dies before ever reaching the Promised Land. And God chooses Joshua to command the Israelites.
So far, it's taken 40 years and thousands of deaths to get to where Joshua and the Israelites are. But understanding where Joshua has been gives us a pretty good insight into what's coming next in his story. Because as difficult as it has been so far, the next part of getting to Canaan is going to be even bloodier.
Joshua, now solely in charge, develops a strategy to conquer Canaan. He needs to gain control of the mountain chain that runs through the center of the country.
Once on that mountain spine, he not only controls all the passes across the country, but he's free from counterattack from Canaanite armies, which are chariot heavy, whereas Israelite armies are essentially light infantry.
The Israelite army is perfectly suited for hit-and-run tactics over rugged terrain, and they're going to play to their strength.
Joshua calls together his 8,000 soldiers and announces the location of their first attack. It will be against one of the world's oldest cities, the fabled city of Jericho.
Joshua attacked Jericho because this is the first step in an Israelite war of extermination.
The Israelites have no intention of settling in Canaan as long as there are other people still in Canaan. They intend to attack cities and drive them out and to replace their populations with their own. Jericho is fairly small, has a small population, almost defenseless.
But Jericho does have its famous walls, which are actually two walls about 12 feet apart that run parallel to each other. The walls are believed to be about 30 feet tall, stretching 1,400 yards around. Some of the people of Jericho live in the space between the two walls. Understanding the layout of Jericho is crucial to the success of overtaking the city.
He doesn't just stroll right in with his army. Like any good commander, he performs a reconnaissance of the objective. And here he sends 2 spies into the city of Jericho to check out its defenses and to see what else is going on.
He's taking this army into Canaan for the first time. The one thing he can't avoid is a defeat or a colossal screw-up. He wants to make sure that this becomes a military success.
The spies sneak inside Jericho and head to a brothel. A cunning decision.
Choice of an inn or house of prostitution is absolutely brilliant. This is a small city. Strangers would immediately be recognized. The only place they could, if not hide, but have a good excuse for being there would be in a house of prostitution. That's also where tongues wag a lot. And a lot of loose gossip could be picked up about troop dispositions, morale, etc.
They find a prostitute willing to help them. Her name is Rahab.
Rahab tells the Israelite spies about the conditions in Jericho. And what's very clear is that the morale of the people is shot. The tales of great slaughter during the Jordanian campaign have reached their ears. So they're literally scared to death that they're going to be attacked.
The Bible states that Rahab lives in between the parallel walls.
Now, this is important because, as we'll see, there are some who believe that the location of Rahab's house is the key to how the Battle of Jericho went down.
It's now dark, and the Israelite spies are prepared to leave Jericho and to return to Joshua with their intelligence report.
But their cover is blown.
The king of Jericho's intelligence service picks up the fact that the Israelite spies are in the city and track them to Rahab's apartment and go to Rahab and demand she turn over the Israelite spies.
According to the Bible, Rahab covers for the Israelites. It is true, she said, the men did come to me, but I didn't know where they were from. And at dark, when the gate was about to be closed, the men left, and I don't know where the men went. Quick, go after them, for you can overtake them.
And apparently, they're happy with his explanation. One assumes they might have done a search, but given Rahab's profession, she was probably pretty persuasive. So, where were the spies? Well, the Bible tells us she actually hid them on the roof.
Now, under the cover of darkness, the spies must escape the city and return to Joshua.
But before they go, they say to Rahab, because you have helped us, when the attack comes to the city, we want you and your family to be spared. So in order that we know that this is your house, take a red cord and tie it to the window, and no harm will come to you or your family.
Rahab ties the red cord in the window, and the spies slide down the rope on the outside of the wall. The men report to Joshua with important intelligence. Jericho's small population is terrified and therefore vulnerable. The information gives Joshua the confidence that now is the time to attack the city. Joshua leads his army across the Jordan River toward Jericho.
This is a big army. Our estimates are 8,000 to 9,000 men, one of the largest armies that's ever been put to the field in Canaan.
Inside the walls, the citizens of Jericho were terrified. Here comes the army they've heard about that has just slaughtered their way through the Jordan Valley.
Jericho is a small city, only about 8 acres, roughly the size of 8 football fields.
To estimate the population of ancient Jericho, based on the rough benchmark historians use of about 240 inhabitants per urban acre times about 8.5 acres, you arrive at a population of about 2,500, somewhere in there, about 20%, which can be mustered to defend the city.
The perimeter walls are almost a mile in circumference.
So you have an army outside of 8,000 to 9,000 men surrounding a city that can mount no more than 500 defenders on the walls. That's about 1 every 3 meters. The Israelite army could encircle Jericho, one with a man 1 meter apart, 6 men deep.
But this huge army doesn't attack. For 6 days, Joshua marches his men around Jericho.
The biblical description of the plan seems on the face of it absurd. According to the Bible, Yahweh says to Joshua, "You shall march around the city for 6 days."
According to the Bible, on the 7th day, the Israelites are supposed to blow their shofars, or battle horns.
And the walls shall come tumbling down. And everyone knows the old song of Joshua at the Battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down.
Joshua commanded the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." At the sound of the trumpet, when the people gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed, so every man charged straight in, and they took the city. The walls fall down, and Jericho's defenses crumble. Is it a miracle? Or is there another explanation? The walls of Jericho come tumbling down. Joshua and the Israelites have their first victory in Canaan.
But there's got to be a more pragmatic military explanation, and I think the Bible actually reveals it if you know where to look. And the secret is Rahab the prostitute.
Remember how the Israelite spies got out of Rahab's apartment? She let them down on a rope that she had. They also told her to tie a red cord to the windowsill. And the reason for that, ostensibly, was that the Israelite army would know that this was her apartment and no harm would come to her.
But once inside the city walls, the Israelite soldiers obviously won't be able to see a marker visible only from the outside.
So now you have to ask, what is a red cord signifying hanging from a window 2 or 3 stories up the wall? And I think that's the answer to how the walls came tumbling down.
The red cord may be a signal, but if the story is looked at from a military perspective, a completely different motivation becomes apparent.
What if the red cord is not there to say, hey, don't attack us? What if it's an invitation up? Who's to say that Rahab doesn't lower the same rope out the window that the spies used to climb down? But now Israelite soldiers are climbing up it.
The Israelite army creates the perfect cover for these soldiers by marching around the city perimeter and loudly blowing their battle horns.
When the noise was going on, it would have been a simple task to take 8, 10, 12 guys at a time and climb up the rope using the red cord as an indicator of where her apartment was and hide in her apartment or on the roof. For 6 days, 10 men at a time, give or take, at 50, 60 special ops guys are now inside the wall.
On the 7th day, the army is still marching around the city. Joshua gives the command, and once again the Israelites blow their horns, one last time.
What that noise was probably a signal to the special ops guys. And what they would have done is emerge from hiding quickly
and attacked the defenders from the inside, threw open the gate, and the walls came tumbling down.
Given that there were so many men outside relative to the number of defenders, they could have easily cleared a section of the wall. This would have made it easy for Israelite soldiers to scale up over the top, and the walls, metaphorically speaking, would have come tumbling down.
With the city firmly in Joshua's hands, what he does next has actually horrified people who read the Bible. he puts the entire city to the sword. The term in Hebrew is kol ha-nesama, to go up upon the city and to kill every breathing thing.
The massacre is up close and personal.
This is a war of extermination. Joshua is sending a message to the other kings of Canaan. This is your fate if you do not leave. They killed every man, every woman, every child, every goat, every sheep, every jackass, literally every living thing. And then they burn the city. It's a horrible, horrible fate that he visited upon the poor people of Jericho. Joshua is a fine tactician and a fine strategist. But one suspects as well that he's also a God-intoxicated man. He's prepared to visit this horror on a completely innocent population in order to achieve not only military goals, but perhaps to achieve the promise of Yahweh, that you shall go upon the land of Canaan and take those cities that I have given you for your inheritance. Well, the price of the inheritance, in human terms anyway, is very high indeed.
But the bloodshed has only just begun. Joshua's reason for destroying Jericho was primarily psychological. Strategy determines his next target. The city of Bethel, about 10 miles north of modern Jerusalem, controls a key pass into the mountains. From here, Joshua can begin to control the central mountain spine of Canaan.
Bethel represents one of the few places on the spine where an invading force can grab a foothold. So they need that pass before Joshua can put the rest of his strategy in effect by being able to move onto the spine itself, move in both directions, and neutralize all the Canaanite city-states.
Before Joshua's 8,000-man army moves ahead, he sends a small reconnaissance force to Bethel. On their way, they come across an urban ruin called Ai.
Ai was a highly fortified town about 1,000 years earlier. But during Joshua's time, it's just a ruin. But the ruin plays an important role in the next phase of Joshua's conquest.
Joshua's recon team reports that Bethel and Ai will be easy to defeat.
And they give him the advice not to send the whole army up to the ruin because there's not much point to it.
Trusting the information, Joshua sends only a small force of about 600 men to Ai. He has no idea that the Bethelite army lies hidden in the ruin.
At Ai, Joshua makes one of the few rare mistakes. The function of a reconnaissance platoon is to report the situation on the ground, not to make operational suggestions.
While the rest of the platoon remains outside, a small reconnaissance team enters the ruin.
What probably happened is the place looks deserted and they stumble into the ruin and they're ambushed.
Most of the reconnaissance team is slaughtered. The remaining Israelite platoon outside the ruin panics and retreats. The ambush at Ai becomes Joshua's first defeat. Joshua's victory at Jericho is blunted in Ai, where the Israelites suffer their first defeat since they invaded Canaan. A small platoon of Israelite soldiers are ambushed and then slaughtered by a Canaanite group called the Bethelites.
Now it's interesting what Joshua does, or what's going through his mind at this time. He's concerned not so much about the small battlefield defeat, but he's concerned about the effect on the psychology of the Canaanites. He had destroyed the city of Jericho to send a psychological shockwave through the Canaanite city-states, and now his own forces have been defeated. So the Bible tells us he's concerned that he had lost that psychological advantage. And so in order to compensate, he quickly decides to move into the attack.
The next morning, Joshua mobilizes his entire 8,000-man army and marches them to Ai.
Joshua's march on Ai takes most of the day, and they arrive at dusk. The army maneuvers into a position behind some hills to the east of the urban ruin.
Between Joshua's army and Ai is a shallow valley in the shape of his saddle. Joshua sets up the Israelite camp so it's out of view of the Bethelites. After surveying the ruin himself, he understands how his men were ambushed. The ruins of Ai make a chaotic battlefield, 14 acres of rubble enclosed by a collapsed wall. It's a jumble of debris and caved-in buildings, perfect ambush territory.
If you looked at the city of Fallujah after the Marine Division got through with it, it would look like that. So you can see the tactical advantage is that you can spread your troops, even a small number of troops, in that urban environment where they can take advantage of that rubble. It means your adversary cannot bring his numbers to bear as he can in the open field. He's got to funnel them down little corridors where they're subject to hand-to-hand combat.
Joshua sets a new plan into motion, one that shows off his tactical brilliance. It will be a deception that will draw the Bethelites into committing a military blunder.
He immediately sizes up the situation and understands that the army that is in Ai is probably most of the army from Bethel, but not all of it. And so if he decides to attack that ruin, he's going to leave his flank or even his rear open up to a possible relief column moving down the road from Bethel.
Instead of attacking the Bethelites in the ruin, Joshua positions some of his troops on the plain in front of the ruin, challenging the Bethelites to fight in the open.
But he only lines up about 1,000 of his men. One can imagine the Bethelite commander saying, "This whole Israelite threat has been overblown with the siege of Jericho. This is all they can muster? We can deal with this."
But what the Bethelite commander doesn't understand is that Joshua has left several thousand soldiers out of sight in the back of the hills. He's also concealed another special operations force of a few thousand on the other side of Bethel. Convinced that their 2,500-man army can easily beat this small Israelite force they see in front of them, the Bethelites move most of their fighters out of the ruin and onto the plain,
thus giving up the tactical advantage of the defense in the ruins where they would have had the advantage of ambush and hand-to-hand combat.
The two armies battle on the open plain.
It's blood, hair, and eyeballs up close, and the battle rages.
The bronze sickle sword is the primary weapon of both armies. Its foot-long blade and handles are cast from a single solid piece of bronze for extra strength. Both also carry 6-foot-long wooden spears. Thrusting weapons are tipped with sharpened bronze. The Israelites also use slings that turn small rocks into deadly projectiles that kill like bullets. Quickly, the battlefield at Ai becomes a death zone. The Israelites, still standing on the battlefield, are overwhelmed and retreat.
Now, at this point, the Bethelites, of course, break into a run and begin to pursue. But the real interesting fact is that the reserve units that the Bethelites had left behind in Ai also abandon the ruin and begin to join in the pursuit, figuring to catch up with the Israelites and make a great slaughter of it all and put this vague Israelite threat of invasion to rest once and for all.
As Joshua reaches the top of the hill, he stops, turns and flashes his sickle sword in the sun, sending a signal to 1,000 Israelites hidden west of the ruin. As soon as he held out his hand, the ambush came rushing out of their station.
Joshua signals the force, and they come out of their hidden position and burn the Bethelite camp in Ai to the ground.
Now you have the Bethelites on the open plain look to their rear, and their camp is on fire. They now realize that they're caught from behind as well.
But Joshua is not finished. He flashes another signal, this time to the main body of his army, about 5,000 soldiers. They've been waiting behind the ridge.
One can only imagine the terror of Bethelite soldiers as suddenly an enormous host of 4,000 to 5,000 men who had been hidden to this time appears over the edge of the saddle, and now begins with Joshua's forces, who turn around, join up, and begin to attack downhill.
The Bethelites are caught between two Israelite forces. Outnumbered 3 to 1, the Bethelites are trapped and slaughtered. At the Battle of Ai, the Israelite military commander Joshua uses superior battlefield tactics to defeat a Canaanite group called the Bethelites.
What Joshua does at Ai is he bluffs. He doesn't show his full hand, and he gets his opponent to go all in. And then he takes him for all he's worth.
We'll see throughout Joshua's life these indications of a brilliant tactician, of an individual, and strategist, of an individual who has a firm grasp of military reality.
The Israelites are experienced warriors who have numbers, and Joshua, a brilliant commander, in their favor.
The result is an absolute slaughter. The Bethelites are quickly enveloped, and they're just massacred.
Joshua orders the extermination of all of them. And again, and this is, you see what Joshua is doing. You know, it's a very cruel story, but he has a dual purpose here. One, again, he wants to regain that psychological edge by striking terror in the remaining Canaanite kings. Secondly, he cannot simply allow the Bethelite forces to remain behind his line of communication. They all have to die, and they all do.
And that includes the Bethelite king, who is captured alive. Joshua orders his men to bring the king to the gates of Bethel, where he is hanged. He hung the king on a tree and left him there until evening. With the public execution of the Bethelite king and its army destroyed, the strategic city of Bethel surrenders.
Joshua's tactical brilliance really shines at the Battle of Ai. If he had presented his entire army in front of the city, the Bethelites would never have come out and taken him on the open battlefield. They would have clearly seen, they would have been overpowered, and they would have hunkered down inside the city. And then he would have been caught up in this slow battle of attrition, and that's something Joshua couldn't afford. He couldn't afford to lose time or men.
So Joshua now has regained the strategic initiative and tactical initiative. He's destroyed Jericho. He's moved his army successfully to grab the opening to the mountain spine, which runs longitudinally in Israel. And he also has a psychological edge reestablished again. Once more, he has struck fear in the hearts of the Canaanite kings, whose kingdoms guard that mountainous ridge that is the prime strategic target of Joshua's military operations.
Joshua's next move is diplomatic. He convinces Canaanite tribes in the mountains to join the Israelites as allies.
These are tribes that are armed with their own military forces, much like the Israelites are. And they're outside the influence of the Canaanite city-states. This conveys upon him an enormous military advantage. First of all, now, he can move along the spine, at least to the north, without having to deal with these tribes. They're now his allies. Secondly, they make his logistics easier. they too have supply depots. They too have crops and animals that he can draw on.
They have no vested interest, of course, in protecting the Canaanite states. So they sign on to Joshua's army as mercenaries.
Using population data, we can estimate that Joshua's army at Jericho was about 8,000 men. And while the Bible doesn't tell us how many additional men were added here, it's not unlikely that it was at least 3,000 to 4,000. So now you're looking at a military force with a manpower strength of about 12,000 soldiers.
With his strengthened army, Joshua marches to his next target, Gibeon, a walled mountain city that's strategically located. Gibeon controls a key east-west pass and a major north-south trading route.
Here is where Joshua cashes in his psychological chips. The word of the slaughter of Jericho and at Ai has reached Gibeon. As the Bible tells us, they were frightened to death. They suggest to Joshua, there's no need for a battle here. We'll become your allies.
Joshua's plan is falling into place. He signs a pact with Gibeon and adds their fighting force to the Israelites. Together, they cut off important Canaanite trade routes on the central mountain spine of the country.
This is not a situation that the Canaanite kings can tolerate for very long. And so the Jebusite king of Jerusalem, Adonizek, sends a message to the 5 other great kings of the area to come up and join me against Gibeon. And the armies of all 5 kings begin to converge on Gibeon, and they surround it and bring it under siege.
The 5 Canaanite kings command a combined force of nearly 15,000 men. They are a powerful army of heavily armored infantry and chariots. Outgunned and surrounded, the Gibeonites send a message to Joshua about the siege. The people of Gibeon thereupon sent this message to Joshua in the camp of Gilgal. Do not fail your servants. Come up quickly and aid us and deliver us, for all the Amorite kings of the hill country have gathered against us. Joshua honors the pact. It's only been 2 months since the Battle of Ai, but the Israelite military machine is on the move again. They begin an 18-mile night march across some of the most rugged terrain in all of Canaan.
Going from Gilgal to Gibeon, you climb 1,500 feet in altitude. And you're talking about moving a large amount of people, upwards of 12,000, through very rocky terrain, and doing it all with command and control in order to bring that force into position where it can strike and do so by achieving tactical surprise.
At some point in the middle of the night, the Israelites reach the east side of Gibeon.
To understand what's going on, you have to understand the kind of topography in which Gibeon is located. Gibeon is actually located in a valley, but in the center of the valley is the Reis Nal, and the city is located on the Reis Nal.
The combined Canaanite armies surround Gibeon in the valley below.
Joshua's army arrives behind the hills outside of Gibeon at about 3 o'clock in the morning. They're exhausted from the march. They're hungry, they're thirsty, but they can't have fires to warm themselves. They can't have fires to cook. They can't even make a lot of noise. And the reason is they're in essentially at the final coordination line before going into the attack.
Joshua designs a clever new battle plan that combines the element of surprise with a precise timing for his attack.
Any noise, any mistake, any braying of a donkey, certainly any firewood, would give away their position and completely squander the advantage of tactical surprise that Joshua has worked so hard to bring about.
Many historians believe that Joshua waits until the break of dawn to launch his attack.
The Bible says that Joshua prayed to the Lord to make the sun stand still.
Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel, O sun, stand still over Gibeon. O moon, over the valley of Elon. So the sun stood still and the moon stopped. There has never been a day like it before or since. a day when the Lord listened to a man.
What probably happened in just physical terms was that we've all seen early morning where the sun is coming up and the moon is still present in the sky. And that's apparently what happened. It gives us an idea of the time of day at which this thing was fought.
The time of day is crucial because he's using a force of nature as an ally, the sun.
Joshua leads this army up over the hills and strikes downhill with the sun at his back. Takes the Canaanite armies who were still in their camp, still having breakfast, still in their tents half asleep, and just smashes into them.
The carnage begins. Sunrise. Joshua and the Israelite army attack Canaanite forces near the town of Gibeon.
Here come 12,000 screaming Israelites down a hill at full speed. You can imagine a Canaanite soldiers awakened by the screams of battle, stumbling out of their tent with no armor, no weapons, and then looking up, trying to gain their senses about them, only to be blinded by the low-lying sun shining right into their eyes. And behind the hot spots in their eyes is nothing but Israelite swords.
The Canaanites are unarmed, half asleep, and temporarily blinded. Joshua has rendered his enemy defenseless.
We see again his knowledge of terrain and tactics. Joshua, the hills surround all of Gibeon. He could have put this army anywhere. He put it in a position so that when the sun rose in the morning, it would be at his back. Plus, he'd be attacking downhill against an enemy that had not yet been fed or even fully awake, taking advantage of all about terrain, geography, and even the movement of the sun, and bringing them all to bear as advantages on one tactical objective.
It's wholesale slaughter. Those who aren't killed run. But there is no escape. The Israelites hunt them down, determined to leave no survivors.
What Joshua has in mind is nothing less than the extermination of some of the most powerful, of the armies of some of the most powerful city-states in all Canaan. They're not going to live to fight another day. They keep chasing and pursuing the Canaanites who are fleeing in all directions until sunset. Then they rest that evening, get up at the crack of dawn again, and continue the pursuit. You're talking about an infantry force that moved 30 miles in 48 hours, 2/3 of the time being engaged in combat. That's a magnificent military achievement for any military force, even a modern one. But to see this done in the days of the Bible really gives a kind of sense of how militarily sophisticated a commander like Joshua was. He fought one of the greatest and most studied battles in the history of the world.
It's a crucial strategic victory for the Israelites and a critical turning point in Joshua's invasion of Canaan.
At this point, Joshua has achieved many of his strategic objectives. He's in control of the central mountain spine. He has either made agreements with or destroyed major Canaanite city-states on that spine. So for the most part, Joshua succeeded.
According to the Bible, Joshua goes on to defeat dozens of Canaanite kingdoms, but he fails to capture all of the Promised Land.
At the end of the day, Joshua simply lacks both the size and mix of force that would make it possible to bring about the complete conquest of Canaan and its resettlement by the Israelites. The result is that even as the Bible tells the story, Joshua was never able to do this, and he dies a rather bitter man.
Toward the end of his life, Joshua retires from combat and fades into anonymity.
And he was buried alone on a place which translates from Hebrew, angry mountain. And it is said in the Bible that no one attended his funeral. And it's one of an unfitting end for one of history's great commanders.
More than 300 years later, Joshua's bloody conquest of the Promised Land, particularly the Battle of Jericho, remain one of the Bible's most popular tales.
There's a certain mythology about Jericho. It has all the elements of a great thriller. There's spies, psychological warfare, there's strategy, suspense, and of course violence. It stays with you.
The story of Jericho has been burned into the human consciousness. When you think about the wholesale slaughter of civilian population, presumably with God's blessing, it raises some deep questions about what that says about the Bible.
Joshua's military strategies of encirclement and psychological warfare echo throughout history.
In April 1975, the army of communist North Vietnam, under the command of the famous general Nguyen Giap, was closing in from all sides on the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon. Ahead of the armed forces were a wave of rumors that were sapping the will of Saigon's people to fight.
Like Joshua, Giap encircles Saigon with his troops. He basically ties a noose around the city and slowly tightens it. At the same time, Giap's reputation precedes him. The people of Saigon remember his Tet Offensive 7 years earlier, with mass executions of thousands of South Vietnamese civilians.
Some say that the Viet Cong had operatives in Saigon in 1975 who helped to feed the rumor mill, building up the horrors that would befall the civilian population, like people getting their nails yanked out and other torture. Just awful stuff.
Joshua is best known as the man who brought the Israelites home to the promised land of Canaan, a land that continues to be drenched in blood.
Ancient Canaan comprises what is today Israel and the occupied territories. The land disputes are still ongoing. Blood is still being shed. 3,500 years after Joshua first led the Israelites into what is to be their biblical home, a legacy of violence endures in the promised land.
It was God who promised the land to the Israelites, but it was a man who ultimately brought his people home. The cunning and brutal military genius